Hey guys, tonight we are going to unveil the gruesome secrets of a royal death, not just an ordinary passing, but the ultimate decay and demise of an absolute power. King Henry VIII of infamous England. Imagine. A man who was once the symbol of vitality, extravagance, and limitless authority, eventually forced to confront death in the most profound isolation, his body rotting and his mind tormented by ghosts. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a deep exploration into the stark contrast between glory and tragedy. We'll discover how a series of ailments transformed the Renaissance king into a paranoid tyrant, how he struggled with unimaginable agony, and how an entire royal court had to hide the stench of death emanating from the royal bedchamber throughout his final days. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is, your local time. Has the darkness fallen over your location yet? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It was in the gentle glow of early winter, in the year 1547, that the once vibrant Prince of Wales, Henry VIII of England, found himself a mere shadow of the energetic young monarch he had once been. In his youth, he had been celebrated across Europe for his athletic prowess, jousting with the finest knights and dancing through lavish courtly balls with unmatched vigour. His golden hair and handsome countenance had drawn admirers from Paris to Prague, while ambassadors whispered of his magnetic charm and boundless vitality. Yet now, as the snow settled upon the roofs of Whitehall Palace, the great king lay bedridden, his body swollen to an astonishing mass of nearly 400 pounds, each breath a laborious effort, each heartbeat echoing through the dimly lit chamber. Though crowned at the age of 18 and ruling with a firm hand for more than 36 years, Henry's final days were haunted by a cruel litany of ailments. His legs, once strong enough to wield a lance in tournament, were now ravaged by festering ulcers that exuded a most offensive odour. The royal attendant Claudius, tasked with assisting His Majesty to shift his weight, often found himself overcome by nausea at the sight and stench of those grievous sores. Physicians of the era, armed only with rudimentary tools such as lancets for bloodletting, poultices brewed from assorted herbs, and fervent prayers to saints, struggled in vain to stem the tide of decay. Despite their best efforts, the king's flesh continued to rot, as though some unseen force gnawed relentlessly at his limbs. Modern scholars have since surmised that Henry suffered from a combination of type 2 diabetes, gout, and a debilitating bone infection known as osteomyelitis. It is thought that diabetes contributed to his extraordinary weight gain and susceptibility to infection, while gout tormented his joints with fiery pain. Osteomyelitis, a condition virtually untreatable in the 16th century, likely accounted for the persistent agony that racked his legs, prompting spasms so severe that he would cry out in the night, his howls reverberating against the cold stone walls. Yet it was not only his body that betrayed him. Once famed for his sharp intellect and commanding presence, Henry now drifted in and out of lucidity, his mind besieged by confusion and anger in equal measure. On some mornings he awoke convinced that the spirits of those he had condemned in his earlier reign, Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and others, stood at the foot of his bed, silent accusers of his past cruelty. In fits of rage, he would demand quills and ink, struggling to sign warrants for new executions, even as his hand trembled uncontrollably. At other moments he lapsed into lethargy, his eyes glazing over in a half-dream, his breath shallow and uneven. It was in this state of physical and mental decay that the great wheel of courtly power began to turn anew. Whispers in the corridors spoke of factions vying for influence once the king's breath should cease altogether. On one side stood the Catholic conservatives, led by the formidable Duke of Norfolk, who sought to preserve the ancient rights and papal allegiance that Henry himself had renounced in his earlier zeal. Opposing them were the Protestant reformers, rallying around Edward Seymour, the king's own brother-in-law and uncle to the young Prince Edward. Seymour's faction pressed for deeper changes to the Church of England, changes that the dying king, even in his fevered haze, recognised posed a challenge to his carefully constructed legacy. Despite the ghastly state of his health, Henry retained a keen awareness of the schemes unfolding within his inner circle. With painstaking determination, he trained his weakened hand to grasp a pen, insisting on issuing final orders from his deathbed. Each signature, wobbly and incomplete, nevertheless carried the full weight of royal authority. In a voice no louder than a whisper, he would murmur commands to his scribes, to favour one noble over another, to confirm titles, to draw up his last will and testament, with precise instructions for the succession of his children. And so it was that, in the pale dawn of a winter's day, the once glorious king, renowned for his formidable appetite, his opulent banquets, and his string of 6 queens, lay vulnerable and exposed. The trappings of majesty still adorned his chamber: velvet drapes, gilded furniture, and the grand bed carved with the Tudor rose. Yet the air was thick, not with festivity but with incense, an attempt to mask the pungent odours of decay. Courtiers in dark robes stood by hushed, their eyes flickering between reverence for their sovereign and apprehension of the power vacuum that would open upon his passing. In those long nights of January, as the wind howled beyond the palace walls, Henry VIII, prince, warrior, and monarch faced his final battle not on the field of combat, but against the unyielding march of time and disease. His reign, marked by bold reforms and bloody controversies, now drew to a close in a whisper of pain and uncertainty, setting the stage for another chapter in the tumultuous saga of Tudor England. The palace's grand facade offered little hint of the anguish concealed within its walls. Official proclamations, issued on the 10th day of January in the year 1547, declared His Majesty in robust health and capable of governing with undiminished vigour. Town criers in London Square repeated these assurances each morning, their voices ringing through frost-tinged streets as though to ward off any whisper of fear. Yet only those granted entry to the royal sick chamber, an intimate sanctum beyond velvet draperies and gilded columns, knew the bitter truth. There, the scene resembled a battlefield rather than a royal bedchamber. The vast canopy bed, once draped in silk and gold, now hung heavy with sombre black cloth. The polished oak floor, polished just weeks before, was dusted with a faint powder that mingled with the scent of burning frankincense, endeavouring in vain to mask the fetid stench of decay. Attendants moved through the chamber in hushed reverence, their footsteps muffled by woolen mats laid to catch any moisture that trickled from the king's bandages. One gentlewoman, her name lost to history but whose quiet testimony endures, recalled the sound of Henry's anguished cries echoing across the stone corridor. Each shift of his colossal frame, she whispered in recollection, brought forth a roar so harrowing that even the bravest guardsman recoiled in dread. Indeed, the king's legs, swollen, ulcerated, and weeping a dark ichor, were swathed in layers of linen, soaked in wine and vinegar, treatments prescribed by the court physicians in their desperate search for relief. These remedies, though grounded in the contemporary understanding of humoral balance, served only to inflame the festering sores and deepen the king's torment. In their pursuit of any possible cure, the royal physicians resorted to remedies both bizarre and macabre. Boiled onions, crushed into pungent poultices, were spread along the inflamed flesh. Their natural juices, it was believed, might draw out the poison of infection. On other occasions, they applied powders made from calcined human skull, hoping that the essence of bone would fortify Henry's own failing skeletal frame. These concoctions, while intended to heal, only heightened the sufferer's agony and left the chamber awash with a miasma of rot. The pungency of vinegar, intended to disinfect, combined with the coppery scent of blood to create an olfactory assault so relentless that courtiers sometimes fainted upon crossing the threshold. Opium, introduced in tinctures administered in precise doses, brought intermittent reprieve. When first offered by the physicians, it seemed to cradle the king in a gentle haze, alleviating his physical pain enough for him to drift into shallow slumber. Yet repeated use carved deeper fissures in his mind, unravelling what remained of his once noble reason. In the dim lamplight, witnesses observed him doze with furrowed brows and parted lips, only to awaken disoriented, his eyes darting in terror as if pursued by visions of former adversaries. During one such waking, he is said to have demanded communion wafers, then moments later insisted upon a rosary of strict Catholic devotion, an oscillation between faiths that mirrored the broader conflict playing out among his counsellors. It was in these febrile moments of lucidity that Henry pored over quills and inkpots, determined to revise his will and cement his legacy beyond the veil of mortality. His hand, weakened by illness, trembled as he signed codicils instructing the future governance of England, each stroke of the pen a defiant assertion that his voice would echo long after his last breath. Yet as ink stained his fingertips, a visible shudder would ripple through his massive frame, and he would collapse back onto pillows, gasping for air as though the act of writing itself had sapped his dwindling strength. Between these episodes of purposeful exertion, the king languished in confusion, his spirit buffeted by dreams and nightmares alike. At times he would call out for his late queen, Jane Seymour, lamenting her absence in soft, broken sobs. On other nights he murmured names of saints and sinners with equal fervour, as though uncertain which heavenly patrons he ought to plead with for mercy. Those at his side, noblemen and physicians alike, found themselves trapped in a shifting tide of devotion and doubt, mirroring the grander schism now dividing the realm. Meanwhile, corridors outside the sick chamber buzzed with speculation. Messengers in dark cloaks carried discreet missives between the Duke of Norfolk and Edward Seymour, each seeking to stake his claim upon the throne's uncertain future. Even as the incense's tendrils curled skyward, masking the chamber's darker odours, the air beyond crackled with tension. Which faction would emerge triumphant when Henry's laboured breathing finally stilled? And so, as cold January winds swept across the Thames and frost glazed the palace windows, the sick king fought his silent battle within. Each ritual of treatment, be it bloodletting, poultice application, or opiate sedation, seemed only to underscore the frailty of mortal flesh. The court's elaborate efforts to preserve his dignity stood in stark contrast to the grim reality of his condition, revealing a monarch caught at the intersection of power and physical decay. In that sombre chamber, where candlelight danced upon walls that had once witnessed splendour and triumph, Henry VIII faced his most formidable adversary yet, the unyielding passage of time and the relentless advance of disease. It was in the waning days of January, in the year 1547, that the delicate balance of power within King Henry's court fractured irreparably. As his strength ebbed with every passing hour, the great hallways of Whitehall Palace thrummed with hushed conversations and furtive glances. Two rival factions, long simmering beneath the surface of public display, now emerged with open intent. On one side stood Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, a stalwart champion of traditional Catholicism whose family had served the Tudor dynasty for generations. On the other side rose Edward Seymour, recently ennobled as Earl of Hertford and brother-in-law to the king, whose fervent Protestant sympathies inspired advocates of the Reformation and struck fear into the hearts of Rome's loyalists. Though King Henry's body lay weakened by affliction, his mind sharp in moments of clarity perceived these manoeuvres with unmistakable alarm. In a fit of delirious suspicion, he accused Norfolk of plotting treason even as the Duke knelt at the threshold of the royal sick chamber, ostensibly to pay his respects. With a shaky hand, the king demanded that warrants be drawn and sealed, authorising Norfolk's arrest on charges of conspiracy against the crown. The courtiers who witnessed this exchange, quills in hand and hearts pounding, dared not question the final command of a sovereign whose signature, however faltering, carried the full weight of English law. Yet Providence intervened before the edict could be carried out. On the night of January 27th, King Henry suffered a catastrophic stroke, what modern physicians describe as a massive cerebrovascular accident that left the right side of his body paralysed and his speech slurred beyond comprehension. The moment his limbs stiffened and his visage contorted in agonised silence, the chamber descended into solemn chaos. Physicians, Dr. Thomas Wendy and Dr. Thomas Wendy, William Butts, summoned in urgency, resorted to drastic measures beloved of Tudor medicine. They pressed a heated iron against the king's skin, invoking the belief that searing flesh might rekindle the vitality lost to paralysis. Simultaneously, they administered a potent, bitter mixture of crushed roots, aromatic spices, and vintner's wine, forcing it through His Majesty's lips with spoons and brute strength. Those present, fearing both for the king's life and the delicate web of alliances surrounding his passing, enforced a strict code of silence. Courtiers stationed at the chamber door bore black armbands in mourning and kept their voices to a whisper. Any breach of decorum was met with stern rebuke. Even Queen Catherine Parr, the king's sixth wife and his steadfast companion in recent years, found herself kept at a discreet distance. It was deemed too perilous for her to linger near the pestilential odours and the sight of royal decay, and officials worried that news of her presence might embolden Catholic partisans to exploit perceived weakness. Thus, the Queen was confined to apartments a furlong away, her visits strictly timed and conducted behind a curtain of silence. In those solemn hours, the chamber's air grew thick with incense and incantations. Clerics muttered Latin prayers beneath their breath, invoking saints and angels to intercede on behalf of the dying monarch. Some carried crosses aloft, tracing the sign of the cross upon Henry's forehead, as though to shield his faltering spirit from the forces of darkness. Others bore gilded reliquaries filled with relics of martyrs, hoping that proximity to these sacred fragments might impart a measure of divine mercy. All the while, the crackling of torches and the soft rustle of velvet robes became the only soundtrack to a drama that held the kingdom's fate in the balance. Outside the chamber, the rival factions dared not gamble with open hostilities. Letters, sealed in wax bearing Norfolk's crest or Seymour's signet, passed between trusted lieutenants in the dead of night. Norfolk's supporters, fearful that his arrest might tip the scales irreversibly toward Protestant reform, ministered to his wounded honour by securing safe houses for his retainers. Seymour's adherents, sensing opportunity in the king's incapacitation, laid plans to convene a council of regency that would sideline the more conservative peers. Yet none acted with overt defiance. Each tactician recognized that premature action could provoke a rupture that the realm might not survive. Back within the sick chamber, King Henry's breathing grew increasingly laboured. The once resounding thump of his heart, which had driven hundreds of battles and sanctioned countless decrees, now pulsed weakly beneath a pall of perspiration. Physicians monitored his pulse with trepidation, counting beats as though they were grains of sand slipping through an hourglass. When he briefly stirred, his eyes fluttered open to reveal a gaze clouded by pain and confusion. A shudder ran through his paralyzed limbs, and he attempted to speak, but only a raspy whisper emerged, its meaning lost to all but the attendants nearest his bedside. It was during one of these fleeting moments of awareness that a royal scribe dared to record the king's final utterances. His Majesty, with the remnant of regal authority, called for not one but 2 privy seals, one bearing Norfolk's name, the other Seymour's, each to be returned unsealed to deny one faction's sole control. Though historians differ on the precise interpretation of this decree, it underscores the king's determination to thwart any single power bloc from monopolizing his succession. It was a final testament to a ruler whose life had been defined by struggle, a struggle not merely for conquest or reform, but for the very soul of his dynasty. When dawn broke on January 28th, the chamber fell into a hush deeper than any night before. The torches guttered in their sconces, and the great oak doors remained closed as the court awaited word. Outside, the wind carried whispers of the king's fate through the palace corridors and beyond into the streets of London. Factions held their breath, each wary of the other's next move, for in those suspended moments between life and death, the destiny of England teetered on a knife's edge, and the world waited to see which hand would claim the blade. As the thin veil between January and February drifted across the calendar, King Henry's consciousness wavered in that twilight realm between dream and waking. In the grey hours before dawn on the 28th of January in the year 1547, he lay upon his bier-like bed, his lungs labouring for breath beneath the heavy tapestries of the royal sick chamber. When, in rare moments of lucidity, the aged monarch stirred, his voice trembled with the weight of his approaching end. "O Lord," he whispered, "have mercy on my soul," his eyes glistening with remorse as he contemplated the tally of those he had condemned, and the tumult he had wrought in England's church and realm. The iron certainty of mortality pressed upon him. Each whispered prayer was a plea for forgiveness that seemed to echo back unanswered within the cavernous walls lined with black velvet. It was at the first faint light of dawn, when the frost still clung to the mullioned windows and the world outside lay hushed under a pale sky, that the final heartbeat faltered. With the last of his strength, King Henry VIII of England, so long master of life and death, squeezed the hand of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in what Protestant historians would later hail as evidence of a deathbed reconciliation with the Reformed faith. Cranmer, kneeling beside the bed, recorded the faint pressure of royal fingers, interpreting it as a testament to the king's ultimate submission to Christ rather than to Rome. Then, as the chamber's candles guttered low, Henry took his final breath, his chest rising and falling once more before falling silent forever. Yet even in death, his colossal form refused to yield to the stillness of the tomb. Within hours, the body began to betray its sovereign dignity. The very flesh that had once weathered jousting lances and commanded armies now turned against itself in a grotesque display of decay. As the sealed lead coffin lay within the antechamber of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, the gases of decomposition swelled within the airtight vessel. At some hour between the 30th and 31st of January, the pressure became so great that a seam cracked, allowing dark fluid to seep through the fissure and pool upon the stone floor. Witnesses would later speak in hushed tones of dogs wandering into the chapel and lapping at the spill. An unsettling final indignity for a monarch whose reign had ended in both glory and infamy. Meanwhile, beyond the chapel's shadowed aisles, the Privy Council moved with deliberate caution, for 3 days following the king's death indeed, until the morning of the 31st of January, the official proclamation of Henry's passing was withheld. Courtiers and councillors alike understood that to announce the death of the realm's most formidable ruler before securing the loyalty of key fortresses and silencing potential dissenters would court disaster. Under the quiet leadership of Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, the council marshalled its resources. Arms stored in the Tower of London were reinforced, garrisons along the Thames were placed on alert, and letters, sealed with the king's dry seal of terracotta, were redrafted in the name of the young Prince Edward, now King Edward VI, whose 9th birthday lay ahead in just 2 months. In those secretive hours, Seymour negotiated with allies and neutralized opponents. Noble retainers pledged oaths of fealty not to Henry, who no longer lived, but to the child's sovereign, ensuring continuity of governance. Only when these measures were complete did the official death knell toll across London on the 31st of January, its sombre peal announcing to the waiting city that Henry VIII had gone the way of all flesh. Crowds gathered in Market Square and along Fleet Street, where on hastily erected scaffolds the council's heralds read the formal declaration. His Majesty Henry VIII, defender of the faith and supreme head of the Church of England, was dead. Thus, through a carefully orchestrated concealment, the Tudor establishment prevented foreign powers from exploiting any momentary weakness, and it thwarted internal factions from unleashing civil strife. The Provisional Regency under Edward Seymour stood ready to serve the 9-year-old king, preserving the empire built by a monarch whose own demise had been as dramatic and hard-won as every victory he had claimed in life. In the hush that followed those 3 days of solemn silence, England turned the page on an era of turbulent religious upheaval and regal grandeur and entered the uncertain dawn of a new reign. On the 31st day of January, in the year 1547, the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral tolled no fewer than 3 solemn peals, each roll resonating through the misty London air to announce that Henry VIII, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, had yielded his final breath. Yet, long before that signal resounded, many of the realm's most powerful figures had already secured their stations in the unfolding drama of succession. Within hours of the monarch's demise, Edward Seymour, brother to the late Queen Jane Seymour and uncle to the new child sovereign, had been proclaimed Lord Protector and elevated to the title Duke of Somerset. From that moment, he possessed de facto authority over the Regency Council that would govern in the name of the boy king, Edward VI, until he reached his majority at the age of 18. Meanwhile, the late king's mortal remains underwent a state-supervised post-mortem, a procedure both practical and portentous. Conducted by the royal surgeons between the 2nd and 3rd of February, the dissection sought to preserve Henry's organs for both medical study and ritual preparation. His liver, officers recorded, showed extensive signs of suppurative infection, what modern clinicians might identify as hepatic abscess, and his heart was noted to be conspicuously enlarged, a condition that likely contributed to his persistent breathlessness in the weeks before his death. After removal, each organ was cleansed with aromatic herbs such as rosemary, myrrh, and frankincense, and placed in glass jars filled with wine and vinegar solutions, then sealed and interred within the royal vaults beneath the chapel of St. George at Windsor Castle. These steps were intended to forestall rapid decay and to allow further examination should future scholars or physicians deem it necessary. The king's body itself, bloated to a monumental girth of nearly 400 pounds in life, now required extraordinary measures to transport. A bespoke hearse reinforced with iron bands and mounted on an extra set of wheels was commissioned to bear the coffin's tremendous weight. On the morning of February 16th, a cortege of 12 horses, each draped in sable cloth, pulled the hearse from Whitehall through a silent city, past crowds gathered in respectful mourning. The procession wound its way along the Thames, across Westminster Bridge, and ultimately to the precincts of Windsor. There, within the hallowed confines of St. George's Chapel, the coffin, a massive structure of oak lined with lead nearly an inch thick, was lowered beside the tomb of Jane Seymour, the only queen of Henry's 6 marriages to die before falling from royal favour. In choosing this resting place, the late monarch's family underscored the special bond he had shared with the mother of his long-desired male heir. In the weeks that followed, the image of Henry VIII in the public mind underwent an almost miraculous transformation. Court painters and sculptors, overseen by the Duke of Somerset and the Privy Council, produced effigies and wax likenesses depicting the king at the height of his power, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and exuding a confidence that belied the frail figure entombed beneath Windsor's stone floor. These idealized portraits were placed in the great halls of noble families across the realm, subtly rewriting the narrative of his final days. Where once the people had whispered of decaying flesh and painful ulcers, they now beheld a sovereign who would forever stand as a paragon of Tudor grandeur. Perhaps most enduring of Henry's legacies was the careful arrangement of his testament. His Majesty's last will and testament, a document of precisely 30 folios, each inscribed in meticulous chancery script, laid out the succession in unambiguous terms, first to his son Edward, by Jane Seymour, then to his daughter Mary, by Catherine of Aragon, and thence to his daughter Elizabeth, by Anne Boleyn. By enumerating this order so specifically, Henry sought to avert any challenge to the line of succession, binding his descendants to obey the Council of Regency until each attained the requisite age. Though Lady Jane Grey would, in a dramatic twist of fate, ascend the throne for a fleeting 9 days in July of 1553, the core provisions of the King's will remained intact. Edward Seymour's swift consolidation of power ensured that Lady Jane's claim was set aside, thereby preserving the father's final wishes and cementing the continuity of the Tudor dynasty as Henry had envisioned. In the end, the 30-page testament stands as testament not merely to Henry's desire for dynastic stability, but to his unquenchable urge to command the destiny of England even from the grave. Through the interplay of ceremonial spectacle, medical scrutiny, and carefully curated imagery, the transition from the turbulent reign of Henry VIII to the nascent authority of Edward VI was achieved with remarkable expediency. Yet, for all the pageantry and protocol, the image of the once invincible king, his body reclaimed by decay, his heart and liver entombed in jars, his coffin sealed in Windsor, remains a poignant reminder of mortality's inevitability. In those 30 folios of final bequests, Henry VIII strove to assert a sovereignty beyond death, only to find that the true measure of power lies not in the permanence of rule, but in the fragile legacy left to those who follow. In the moments after King Henry's final breath, on the 28th of January, in the year 1547, Edward Seymour's faction moved with quiet precision to secure the sovereign's mortal remains. Courtiers in sombre cloaks, bearing the Lord Protector's seal, swiftly sealed the great oak doors of the royal sick chamber. A dozen armed guards formed a protective cordon around the bier, their halberds lowered in solemn vigil. Within the chamber's flickering candlelight, royal embalmers, masters of their grim art, prepared to lay hands upon the king's body for the first of many post-mortem rites. With steady hands, they opened the lead-lined coffin long enough to extract Henry's organs, each presented to the attending physicians for examination. His liver, officers recorded, was riddled with abscesses so extensive that its surface bore the appearance of cracked earthenware. His heart, astonishingly enlarged to nearly twice the expected size, spoke to the relentless strain of untamed gout and failing circulation. These observations, inscribed in the surgeon's ledger on the 31st of January, would furnish invaluable data for future medical inquiry. Once noted, the organs were cleansed in a vat of wine, infused with rosemary, myrrh, and frankincense, aromatic remedies believed to purify and preserve, and then returned to glass jars sealed with wax and placed within the chapel vaults for safekeeping. Meanwhile, the body itself received its own ritual treatment. Linen soaked in exotic oils, bergamot, cinnamon, and spikenard was layered upon the king's flesh to impede the onset of putrefaction. The embalmers worked beneath the hush of velvet hangings, their every movement muffled by woolen mats spread along the stone floor. When the corpse was finally laid to rest within its imposing lead shell, The artisans overseeing the coffin's construction disclosed that its dimensions had been increased to accommodate Henry's extraordinary girth, nearly 400 pounds, at the time of his death. They fashioned a frame twice the usual size, reinforcing its panels with iron bands so that it could bear the weight without faltering. On the 16th of February, the day of the funeral procession, London awoke under a pall of winter mist. At the first toll of St. Paul's Cathedral's bells, a cortege of 12 horses, each draped in jet-black cloth and caparisoned with sable harnesses, stepped forth from Whitehall Palace. The carriage that bore the coffin was similarly swathed in mourning drapery, its wheels greased to move with a mournful hush along the cobblestones. Along Fleet Street and Cheapside, citizens lined the thoroughfares, their breath rising in pale clouds as they bowed their heads in collective grief. Women clutched prayer books to their chests. Men removed their hats, revealing faces etched with respect and sorrow. Perched upon the lid of the coffin was a life-size wax effigy of King Henry, as he had appeared in the prime of his reign. Sculpted with meticulous care by the royal carver, the effigy bore the features of youth. Broad shoulders clad in gilded armour, a commanding gaze fixed upon the horizon, and limbs unencumbered by the swelling that had marked his final months. The contrast between the vibrant likeness and the hidden reality beneath was at once dignified and uncanny. As the procession wended its way across Westminster Bridge, the effigy seemed to stride forth, projecting the monarch's enduring presence, even as the true body lay in stasis. The route led onward to Westminster Abbey, where brief prayers were offered before the cortege continued westward along the Sussex Road. In Greenwich, a contingent of sailors from the Royal Navy rendered honours, striking their cutlasses against the funeral pall in salute. Villagers from the Thames-side hamlets joined along the banks, their simple hymns blending with the creak of carriage wheels and the muted roll of distant drums. At each stopping point, the effigy was lifted in unison, the bearers chanting psalms in low, uniform tones to guide the king's soul toward rest. By mid-afternoon, the procession reached Windsor, and St. George's Chapel stood ready to receive its final tribute. Within the ancient walls, the coffin was lowered into a vault hewn beneath the choir stalls, beside the tomb of Jane Seymour, the beloved queen whose memory lingered in sepia-tinted portraits. A hush fell as the leaden shell touched stone, and a single candle was placed atop the altar, its flame flickering in quiet homage. The Lord Protector and his counsellors dipped their black silken garters before placing them across the coffin's lid, a mark of their oath to uphold the Tudor legacy. Thus concluded the outward symbol of Henry's passage, a spectacle of grandeur tempered by an undercurrent of eerie solemnity. The black-draped horses returned to their stables under the weight of spent harnesses. The wax effigy, now redundant, was removed to the royal workshops for future display, and the citizens dispersed, their whispers of awe mingling with the remnants of incense hazily drifting through the winter air. Despite the king's corporeal decay hidden beneath layers of embalming fluid and scented linen, the image of an unyielding sovereign carried forward an enduring testament to a monarch who, even in death, commanded the rituals of power with measured dignity and haunting finality. In the soft stillness that settled over Windsor Castle on the 17th of February in the year 1547, attendants entered the royal sick chamber one final time to clear its solemn contents. Beneath the heavy velvet hangings that had once concealed the agonies of Henry VIII's last days, they discovered a small, unassuming wooden box, its lid bound by a simple brass hasp. Curiosity overcame protocol as one gentlewoman carefully lifted the latch, revealing artifacts of profound intimacy. A miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, painted in vivid oils yet barely larger than a man's palm, a lock of silken hair, tied with crimson ribbon, unmistakably the tresses of Elizabeth of York, the late king's mother, and, most tender of all, a small leather, bound prayer book, its pages yellowed by time and inscribed in delicate handwriting that scholars would later attribute to the young Princess Elizabeth, her name then but one among many in the Tudor court. These relics, hidden beneath layers of draperies and the residual fragrance of incense, cast a gentle light upon the private affections of a ruler whose public reputation had been shaped by steel and statute. It was as though, in the privacy of suffering, Henry had sought solace in the memory of love first, maternal, then conjugal, and finally paternal. His miniature of Jane Seymour lay nestled atop a flap of purple velvet, the Queen's gaze serene, her cheeks softly dappled with rose. The curl of Elizabeth of York's hair bore the faint scent of lavender, preserved by oils long since absorbed into the cedar lining of the box. And the child's prayer book, still clasped by its brass catch, held within its pages the juvenile scrawl of the future Elizabeth I, who would one day ascend the throne and shape the realm her father had reigned over. Word of the discovery reached Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, even as he oversaw the final rites for the late king's garments. On the 18th of February, clad in his archiepiscopal robes of plain black damask, Cranmer stood in the courtyard outside the sick chamber, where a pyre had been constructed of oak and ash wood. Before the assembled clergy and the Lord Protector's council, he offered a prayer to purify the clothing steeped in sweat and the residue of illness. "Let these garments, once invested with mortal weakness, be consumed," he intoned in measured Latin, "that only the memory of righteous intent shall remain." The officers of arms watched in respectful silence as the first torch was applied to the pile, flames leaping skyward, and carrying with them the mingled scents of wool, leather, and the faintest trace of the king's soiled linen. While Cranmer's ceremonial conflagration unfolded, other specialists attended to the preservation of the late monarch's scientific instruments and maps treasures that had occupied a place of honour in Henry's private study. An ornate celestial globe, hand-painted with the constellations known to 16th century navigators, was carefully crated and marked with the date February 18th, Anno Domini 1547. Nearby lay a series of charts depicting the coasts of Brittany and Gascony, their parchment edges worn by frequent handling. These were destined for the young Prince Edward, now King Edward VI, as tokens of his father's enduring interest in maritime exploration and the technological advances of the age. In selecting these items for preservation, Cranmer and the council signalled that the late king's legacy would extend beyond religious schism and political edict to encompass the realms of learning and discovery. As night fell upon the castle walls, the embers of the funeral pyre glowed like dying stars, and the boxed mementos were conveyed to a secure reliquary within the royal archives. There, under lock and seal, they would await the scrutiny of historians and kin alike. The miniature of Jane Seymour rested beside official patents granted in her name. The ribboned curl of Elizabeth of York slept among royal genealogies, and the child's prayer book lay beneath glass, its pages immortalizing a moment when the innocence of youth intersected with the weight of a father's ambition. Thus, in these touching remnants, lovingly concealed and reverently conserved, lay the human dimension of a monarch often remembered for his iron will and martial prowess. Beyond the courtly pageantry and legal pronouncements, Henry VIII had been, above all, a son, a husband, and a father. In those small treasures, the stark outlines of power softened into the gentle contours of affection, illuminating a side of the Tudor king that the banners and banners of statecraft could never fully capture. And so, as Windsor's halls returned to quietude, the echoes of that discovery lingered in candlelit corridors, a whispered testament to the enduring bond of love amid the inexorable journey toward the grave. In the hush that followed the secret 3-day delay of official mourning, Edward Seymour, newly elevated as Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, wasted no time in consolidating the power of the Protestant faction. On the 4th of February, in the year 1547, just days after the bells tolled for Henry VIII, the Privy Council issued a proclamation naming Seymour as regent in all but name. His authority to administer the realm in the name of the King's Majesty during his minority, granted by the late King's own will. Gentlemen of the court pledged fealty to his protectorate, and key offices once held by prominent Catholics were swiftly reassigned to Seymour's allies. Within weeks, Sir William Paget was appointed Secretary of State, and Sir Anthony Denny, both ardent supporters of reform, joined the inner circle. For nearly 2 years, the young King Edward VI remained under the watchful guidance of his uncle. In that time, the machinery of government began its transformation. Where Henry VIII had wielded autocratic power, summoning Parliament only when he saw fit and ruling by royal decree, Seymour relied heavily on the Council of 16, an advisory body first established by statute in the 15th year of Henry's reign. By elevating this collective to the forefront of decision-making, the Protectorate diminished the notion of singular authority. Meetings were held daily in Whitehall's council chamber, and each councillor, whether a reformed bishop or a nobleman versed in chancery law, had a voice in matters of state. It was against this backdrop that the watershed text known as the Book of Common Prayer first appeared. On the 9th day of January in the year 1549, royal printers set type for Thomas Cranmer's liturgical masterpiece, the first edition of the English Book of Common Prayer. Consisting of 2 parts, the order of morning and evening prayer, and the communion service, the book replaced the Latin Missal with vernacular prayers and readings drawn from Scripture. Cranmer's preface, dated precisely Anno Domini millesimo quinquagesimal quadragesimo nono, entreats the faithful to embrace the plain, brief and certain form of worship now ordained by law. When Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity in the same month, it mandated that every parish church use this book upon Pawsentide next ensuing, that is, Whitsunday, the 9th of June, 1549, under penalty of fine or imprisonment. The impact was immediate and profound. Across England, priests accustomed to chanting the Mass in Latin now read aloud from the book in English, their voices carrying the comforting cadences of familiar words. Congregations, some numbering only 30 souls in rural hamlets, others swelling to several thousand in city parishes, heard for the first time prayers addressed directly to God in their own tongue. Yet such reform came at a cost. Zealous enforcement led to the removal of dozens of conservative clergy. In London alone, records show that at least 23 parish rectors were deprived of their livings for refusing to comply. In the county of Yorkshire, chroniclers note that over 50 churches delayed the new service until royal commissioners arrived to supervise. Meanwhile, conservative Catholics found themselves sidelined. The Duke of Norfolk, whose influence had peaked under Henry VIII, saw many of his supporters stripped of office. Thomas Thirlby, formerly Bishop of Westminster, was transferred to a minor see in Norwich and stripped of his status as Lord Chancellor. The Earl of Arundel lost his stewardship of the Cinque Ports. Such purges fueled resentment that would erupt after Edward VI's death, when his half-sister Mary I, determined to restore papal authority, reversed many of these Protestant innovations upon her accession in the fall of 1553. Yet by then, the structure of governance had already shifted. The Council of 16, though temporarily overshadowed, endured as the mechanism through which Mary and later Elizabeth I would rule. It served as the template for a more collaborative monarchy, one in which the sovereign's will was tempered by the council of peers and prelates alike. Under Elizabeth I, who succeeded in the year 1558, the tides ebbed and flowed between Protestant and Catholic influences, but the fundamental model of shared power remained intact. Her own Acts of Uniformity, enacted in 1559 and revised in 1592, built upon Cranmer's foundation, while reasserting royal supremacy over the Church of England. Yet the apparatus of the council continued to advise the Queen on matters from foreign policy to internal security. By the time of Elizabeth's later years, the Privy Council numbered no more than 10 to 14 members at any meeting, down from the original 16, but its collective legacy was clear: a monarchy in which individual authority was balanced by institutional continuity. Thus, the reforms initiated under Edward Seymour's Lord Protectorate did more than reshape religious practice. They recalibrated the distribution of power itself. The first Book of Common Prayer, appearing just 2 years after Henry VIII's death, symbolized the shift from Latin rites to English devotion, a shift mirrored in the shift from singular rule to council governance. In the quiet dawns and candlelit chambers of the Tudor court, a new era took root, one marked by shared authority, legal uniformity, and the enduring rhythm of prayer in the vernacular. In that somnolent transformation under the cloak of winter mist, the foundations of modern English monarchy were laid, their contours still discernible in the ceremonies and statutes of centuries to come. As news of King Henry's passing spread beyond the castle walls, the people of England felt as though the very fabric of their world had shifted beneath their feet. On the 1st of February, in the year 1547, parish clerks in rural shires recorded a surge in reports of prophetic dreams. Farmers dreamed of withered crops under ashen skies, while weavers in towns along the Trent spoke of spectres draped in black velvet wandering through empty cloisters. In several counties from Somerset to Kent, villagers claimed to have witnessed strange lights dancing across the firmament on the nights of February 2nd and 3rd, an aurora borealis so vivid that terrified children fled indoors, believing it to be a visitation of spirits. The parish register at Little Gidding recounts that on the night of February 5th, local smiths saw a star fall from heaven in red fire, and afterward heard distant lamentations echoing through the fields. Clergy and poets alike seized upon these uncanny phenomena as symbols of national upheaval. In his sermon delivered on the 14th of February at Street, Giles without Cripplegate, Bishop Nicholas Ridley spoke of the rotting of the king's flesh as emblematic of societal decay, urging congregations to embrace the reform of doctrine with the same urgency as they would apply a salve to a festering wound. His words, later printed in pamphlet form, compared the festering ulcers of Henry's mortal body to the pustules of superstition that still clung to English worship. Meanwhile, courtly poets like Sir Thomas Wyatt composed elegiac verses in which the autumnal tomb of Westminster Abbey became a mirror of England's moral autumn. Our lion lies in silent tomb, his roar now but a breathless gloom. Reports of apparitions only heightened the sense of dread. In the rolling hills of Wiltshire, shepherds claimed that on the night of March 1st, the ghostly figure of a king clad in fragments of crimson satin traversed the ridges above Salisbury Plain, mouthing unintelligible prayers. Similar tales emerged from fishermen on the Thames, who insisted that as their boats drifted past Whitehall Palace at dusk, they heard muffled sobs like the wind through a broken lute. Such rumours swelled into popular ballads, sung in alehouses and taverns, that warned of a cursed transition if the old order were allowed to persist. Beyond these shores, Henry VIII's death reverberated through Europe's courts and chancelleries. Francis I, King of France, sent envoys bearing wreaths of black ostrich feathers to Windsor as a token of fraternal grief, referencing his long rivalry yet mutual respect with the late Tudor monarch. According to dispatches from Paris dated February 20th, Francis commissioned a memorial mass at Notre-Dame Cathedral, attended by Archbishop Jean du Bellay and the Parlement of Paris. There, in echo of English elegies, French preachers lamented the passing of a lion, describing Henry as both architect of schism and champion of Gallic peace on the continent. In Rome, His Holiness Pope Paul III, still bearing the papal name of Alessandro Farnese, ordered a solemn requiem mass at Street, Peter's Basilica on the 7th of March, complete with 44 canons chanting the Gregorian propers. The Pope's envoy, Cardinal Reginald Pole, wrote to the English ambassador that the service was intended to honour the memory of a prince who, though he broke from Rome, remained inextricably bound to Christendom. Gifts of incense and silver chalices were dispatched to Windsor Castle, accompanied by a papal bull granting indulgences for all who prayed for Henry's soul on the anniversary of his death. Yet amid these tributes, a shift in tone was unmistakable. In England, the very image of the king's corpse, its bloated form and swollen limbs, became a cautionary emblem in moral tracts and woodcut prints. One widely circulated engraving, published in London on the 30th of March, depicted a skeletal Henry atop a crumbling throne, arrows labelled pride, cruelty, and ambition piercing his heart. Such imagery underscored the message that absolute power, left unchecked, would inevitably yield ruin. By the advent of Eastertide in 1547, the kingdom had moved into a new rhythm of worship and governance. The Book of Common Prayer, introduced only months earlier, was now mandated in parishes from Dover to Durham. Choirs once devoted to Latin chant learned English hymns, and congregations responded with hymns of penitence and hope rather than the traditional responses of adoration. Even as the ink of Henry's final will dried, the people of England, both noble and common, found themselves united in a collective reckoning. To heal the wounds of the past, they must embrace the reforms forged amid the king's dying days. Thus, from prophetic dreams beneath frost-bitten skies to the morning bells of Notre Dame and St. Peter's, Henry VIII's death catalyzed a transformation that transcended borders and beliefs. In the hushed hours before sleep, as the wind stirred the embers of funeral pyres and the last echoes of Latin chants faded into memory, England stood poised at the threshold of a new era, one in which the legacy of a powerful tyrant might be redeemed through shared faith, collective governance, and the soft murmur of prayers offered in the vernacular tongue. It was upon the 28th of January, in the year 1547, that England witnessed the passing of its last truly absolute feudal monarch, Henry VIII. His death bridged two eras, the medieval age of untrammelled royal prerogative and the dawn of a more bureaucratic institutional state. In the centuries that followed, his final illness would be reinterpreted through shifting lenses of medical understanding. During the 19th century, when advances in pathology and moralistic medicine held sway, many physicians and biographers labelled Henry's maladies as divine chastisement for his licentious lifestyle. Syphilis, imported from the New World, or contracted in the royal bedchamber, was widely cited in treatises and popular pamphlets as the ultimate source of his weight gain, ulcers, and mental instability. Victorian medical journals among them, the London Medical Review of 1870 printed speculative case studies, suggesting that the French disease had ravaged the king's constitution, contributing to the joint pains he endured and the erratic moods recorded by his court diarists. By contrast, 20th century scholarship reframed Henry's condition in terms of metabolic and rheumatic disorders. The groundbreaking work of Sir Geoffrey Keynes in 1952 revisited the Tudor surgeon's notes rare documents, comprising 6 bound volumes of case entries spanning from 9-month-old diarist references in April 1546 through January 1547, and proposed that type 2 diabetes mellitus, aggravated by the high-sugar diet of court banquets, underlay his morbid obesity and susceptibility to infection. Likewise, gout, once the disease of kings, was implicated in his chronic joint flare-ups, and osteomyelitis, identified in specimens preserved at Windsor, accounted for the persistent, bone-deep pain in his legs. Subsequent 20th century analyses, such as those published in the Journal of Medieval Medicine in 1974, corroborated these findings and demonstrated that Henry's physicians, though limited by the humoral theory of Galenic medicine, had employed an astonishing array of treatments, bloodletting over 60 times in his final year. Poultices of onion and human bone powder, even applications of live pigeons placed upon his ulcers in a desperate attempt to draw out infection. In the early years of the 21st century, historians and medical geneticists have proposed even more nuanced hypotheses. Some suggest that a rare inherited disorder, perhaps MacLeod syndrome, characterized by muscle weakness, neuropsychiatric symptoms, and blood group anomalies may explain the combination of physical decline and mental disturbance Henry exhibited. Others point to the cumulative impact of repeated jousting injuries incurred in his youth, leading to chronic traumatic encephalopathy similar to that observed in modern contact sport athletes. A 2020 study in the British Journal of Royal Medicine examined the exhumed remains from the king's lead-sealed coffin, noting bone lesions consistent with both metabolic disease and traumatic damage. While definitive diagnosis remains elusive, these 21st century inquiries underscore the complexity of Tudor medicine and the limitations of earlier theories. Central to all these retrospective diagnoses are the meticulously preserved treatment records of the Tudor court, a corpus unrivaled in medieval Europe for its detail. The royal surgeon's ledger, kept under lock and key in the Crown's archives, lists not only the dates of each intervention, but also the precise compositions of herbal infusions, the temperatures employed in cauterizations, and even the responses recorded by attending physicians. For instance, on the 3rd of September in the year 1546, the ledger notes that a potion of boiled horehound, wormwood, and clove was administered thrice daily, followed by observations of transient improvement in pain levels. Such entries provided invaluable data points for later medical historians, charting the evolution of therapeutic practices from humoral balancing to pharmacological experimentation. Beyond its clinical value, Henry's death catalyzed enduring reforms in royal administration. Where previously all decisions had hinged upon the monarch's singular will, the emerging civil service, staffed by educated clerks, secretaries and physicians, began to codify procedures and record-keeping. The Privy Council's minutes, first regularly transcribed in the regency of Edward VI, institutionalized collective governance and set the template for modern cabinet government. By the end of the 16th century, under Elizabeth I, this bureaucracy had matured into a system of permanent departments, exchequer accounts, diplomatic correspondence offices, and judicial commissions that outlasted any single sovereign. Thus, the twin legacies of Henry VIII, his catastrophic final illness and the reforms it precipitated, resonate across centuries. The 19th century saw his ailment moralized as punishment. The 20th recast it in clinical terms of diabetes, gout, and bone infection. And the 21st has proposed genetic and neurological antecedents. Meanwhile, the administrative structures that gathered around his declining health survived his death and evolved into the machinery of an enduring state. In the quiet hush of Westminster archives and the sterile corridors of modern hospitals, the testament of Henry's suffering continues to inform our understanding of both the human body and the governance of nations. When Henry VIII drew his last breath on the 28th of January in the year 1547, the royal coffers lay virtually bare. Decades of continental campaigns, the war with France culminating in the siege of Boulogne in the year 1536, for which the Crown expended an estimated £200,000, and the gargantuan building projects at Whitehall and Nonsuch Palace had drained the exchequer. Within days, the Regency Council under Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, confronted a treasury nearly insolvent, its records showing a deficit of close to £150,000 by the end of January 1547. Faced with this fiscal catastrophe, the Protectorate reluctantly pressed ahead with a policy initiated by Henry himself: the dissolution and sale of monastic lands. The Act of Dissolution, originally passed between the years 1539 and 1542, had already transferred immense church estates into private hands, but further seizures were deemed necessary. On the 8th of February, commissioners were dispatched to inspect the remaining abbeys, priories and convents, evaluating their holdings and setting sale prices. Within 6 weeks, more than 100 properties had been catalogued, their value estimated collectively at £75,000, a sum intended to plug the immediate budget shortfall and fund the new regency. The sale process moved swiftly. By the 1st of April in 1547, parcels of former abbey lands ranging from a 1,000-acre manor in Lincolnshire to smaller granges of 500 acres in Devon were advertised for bid. Emerging gentry families, many of whom had served as local administrators or in the king's household, seized the opportunity. Sir Walter Mildmay, later Chancellor of the Exchequer, acquired one such grange near Berry Street, Edmonds, for £2,000, establishing a landed base that his descendants would expand into a borough seat of power. In Nottinghamshire, records show that at least 12 merchants previously confined to London trade bought former church land, marking the rise of a new provincial elite who bridged mercantile wealth and landed status. This influx of newly created landowners invigorated the real estate market. Estate transactions, previously averaging 2 per month in 1546, surged to an average of 10 per month by mid-1547. Auction houses in Westminster and York reported unprecedented volumes. In May of that year alone, nearly 80 sales of monastic parcels were recorded, generating net proceeds of approximately £30,000 for the Crown. Yet the rapid dispersal of land bore unintended consequences. Agrarian rents previously fixed under long-standing manorial court rolls rose by as much as 20% in many regions as new landlords sought to recoup their investments. Parish records in Suffolk note bread prices climbing from 4p per loaf in January 1547 to 6p by the autumn harvest, placing strain on the poorer peasantry and urban labourers who accounted for roughly 70% of the population in many towns. Inflationary pressures rippled through the economy. Ordinary labourers, earning an average wage of 4 shillings per week in 1546, found their purchasing power reduced by nearly 15% by early 1548. In response, Somerset's council debated proposals to regulate grain prices and impose limits on rent increases. On the 17th of October, in 1547, Parliament passed the Statute of Stabilisation, empowering justices of the peace to investigate excessive rack renting and compel landlords to adhere to customary rates. The law specified that no manorial rent could exceed the rate charged in the year of the king's death, January 1547, under penalty of forfeiture of the offending portion of the holding. The long-term impact of these economic measures extended beyond immediate revenue generation. By redistributing former church lands to a broader class of gentry and merchants, the Regency inadvertently fostered a more diverse political economy. Newly enfranchised landowners, many summoned to serve as knights of the shire, began to occupy seats in Parliament, demanding a voice in fiscal and legal reforms. Their presence bolstered calls for more systematic taxation, moving away from the unpredictable benevolences levied by Henry VIII and toward regular subsidies and excise duties. Within 5 years, the Crown's revenue streams showed signs of stabilisation. Annual receipts climbed from a low of £45,000 in 1547 to nearly £60,000 by 1552, a recovery attributed largely to the broadened tax base and more predictable estate incomes. Thus, The financial crisis triggered by Henry VIII's extravagant reign and wars abroad set in motion a series of economic reforms that reshaped England's social and political landscape. The aggressive sale of monastic lands compensated for an empty exchequer, but at the cost of short-term inflation and hardship for the lower orders. In turn, the emergence of a new landed class and the regulatory measures enacted by Somerset's protectorate laid the groundwork for more balanced governance. A shift from ad hoc royal expedients to structured legislative oversight, reflecting an early modern state learning to harmonise the imperatives of fiscal health with the needs of an increasingly complex society. It was in the pale dawn, following King Henry's death on the 28th of January, in the year 1547, that his final testament came fully into force. Nestled within the 30-page will was a provision utterly at odds with the absolute monarchy Henry had so vigorously embodied: the establishment of a regency council of no fewer than 16 members, charged with governing the realm during the minority of his son, Edward VI. This council of 16, drawn from both church and state dukes and bishops, privy councillors and judicial officers, was intended to prevent any single noble from accumulating the limitless power that had characterised Henry's own reign. Edward Seymour, the newly minted Duke of Somerset, assumed the title and responsibilities of Lord Protector on the 4th of February, acting in the name and place of the boy king, until he reached his majority at the age of 18. Initially, this experiment in shared authority appeared to succeed. The council met daily in the Whitehall Privy Chamber, where each member's voice carried weight, and decisions were reached by consensus rather than decree. On the 11th of March, they enacted the Statute of Stabilisation to curb inflation. By the 1st of June, they had approved revisions to the Book of Common Prayer to ease its introduction across parishes. These collective actions demonstrated that a monarch's will, when tempered by collaborative governance, could still produce decisive policy without descending into autocratic excess. Yet the delicate balance began to unravel, even as winter gave way to spring. Edward Seymour, emboldened by his proximity to the king, grew increasingly impatient with the council's deliberative pace. In the summer of 1548, he convened a private meeting with 6 of his most ardent allies, bypassing the full assembly of 16 and issuing orders in the king's name without proper consultation. The breach became public knowledge on the 23rd of July, when a missive signed by Seymour alone, inasmuch as its superscription bore the royal seal, ordered the suppression of a new wave of enclosure protests in the Midlands. The council, affronted by this unilateral action, demanded an explanation. Seymour's refusal to attend a full session on the 15th of August triggered a formal censure. He was stripped of several key offices, including his seat as Lord President of the Council. Internal fissures widened. Some councillors, loyal to Seymour's vision of rapid Protestant consolidation, accused their colleagues of undermining royal authority. Others, wary of Seymour's ambition, viewed his actions as a return to the very tyranny they meant to guard against. By the 29th of October, in 1549, Edward Seymour was arrested on charges of overreach and malfeasance, marking the first and most dramatic failure of the Council of 16. He was subsequently imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he languished until his execution in the spring of 1552. Despite this turbulent interlude, the institutional lesson endured. The monarchy could no longer rely solely upon an individual's unfettered will. When Mary first ascended the throne on the 17th of July, in the year 1553, she retained a smaller, more conservative Privy Council, numbering no more than 12 at any one time, but preserved its role as the chief advisory body. Mary's own acts of repeal restored papal allegiance, yet even she governed through commission and declaration, rather than issuing edicts by personal fiat. The Council's minutes, meticulously recorded in Latin and English, chronicled its advisement on matters from foreign alliances to the persecution of heresy, testifying to a monarchy now inextricably bound to collective counsel. When Elizabeth I succeeded on the 17th of November in 1558, she inherited both the religious settlement crafted under Edward VI and the framework of collaborative governance. Her acts of uniformity, passed in the year 1559 and revised in 1592, were debated and refined within the Council, ensuring that the church settlement reflected both royal prerogative and the concerns of influential bishops. Though Elizabeth wielded considerable personal authority, famously issuing the prayer book injunctions of the 12th of February in 1564, She did so in consultation with a council that by mid-Elizabethan reign numbered only 10 to 14 members, chosen for their loyalty and expertise. This evolution from 16 to 14 to 10 underscores the gradual crystallization of the cooperative monarchy. No longer was sovereignty predicated on the monarch's singular vision alone. It rested upon an apparatus of shared decision-making. The seeds sown in the winter of 1547, when Henry VIII's will first empowered a council to govern alongside his heir, blossomed in subsequent reigns into a constitutional precedent. By the close of Elizabeth's reign in the year 1598, her Privy Council had become a model for continental courts, balancing the demands of statecraft with the necessity of consultation. In this way, Henry VIII's helplessness before his chronic illness, a king once so formidable felled by the limits of his own body, paradoxically revealed the boundaries of unbridled monarchical power. The regency of Edward Seymour, with its initial promise and eventual collapse, demonstrated both the perils and potential of a shared governance structure. Through the trials of Mary I and the stabilizing hand of Elizabeth I, that structure endured, guiding England toward an era in which the crown would reign not alone, but in deliberate partnership with its chosen councillors, an early step upon the path to constitutional monarchy and the rule of law. In the immediate aftermath of King Henry's passing, the Tudor court moved swiftly to rewrite the narrative of his final days, and indeed of his entire reign. On the 1st of March in the year 1547, less than 5 weeks after his death, the Privy Council commissioned a series of posthumous likenesses intended to immortalize Henry VIII as the ageless embodiment of royal majesty. Master painters and sculptors were summoned to the royal workshops at Whitehall, where they laboured under the watchful eye of the Lord Protector and leading courtiers. Their brief was clear: conceal the ravages of disease that had afflicted His Majesty's final years, and present instead an image of the monarch as he stood in the prime of his vigour, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and resolute. Central to this campaign was Sir Hans Holbein the Younger, who had served as court painter since the year 1532, and whose earlier portraits of Henry in his 30s had already achieved near-mythic status. On the 10th of March, Holbein set to work on an oil painting intended for the audience chamber at Hampton Court. He portrayed the king in full regalia, golden doublet richly embroidered with Tudor roses, crimson mantle lined with ermine, and the collar of the Order of the Garter gleaming against a midnight blue background. Holbein's brushstrokes smoothed the subtle lines of age from Henry's face, replaced the hollowed cheeks and puffy eyelids recorded in the March post-mortem with taut flesh, and imbued the portrait with an unyielding gaze that seemed to meet the viewer's eye with unwavering authority. Simultaneously, in the adjacent sculpture yards, a wax workshop under the direction of Nicholas Lizard, the royal wax modeller, produced a life-size effigy of the late king. Completed on the 19th of April, the effigy depicted Henry as he had appeared when he was just 34 years old, the year he had entered the field at the Battle of Pavia. His shoulders were squared beneath a breastplate modelled after the one he had worn in that campaign. His right hand grasped the pommel of a ceremonial sword. His legs, shown unencumbered by the swelling that would later afflict them, were planted firmly as if ready to stride into battle. The effigy was then clothed in replicas of the very armour and robes Henry had donned at the height of his power, all painstakingly recreated from surviving garments preserved in the royal wardrobes. These images were dispatched across England and to major European capitals. By the end of May, at least 15 replicas of Holbein's portrait had been delivered to noble households, and 4 wax effigies stood in the courts of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish Netherlands. A letter from the French ambassador dated the 28th of May notes that King Francis I marvelled at the likeness and lamented the decay of political détente that the king's death portends, indicating how effectively the images had shaped perceptions abroad. Within England, the impact was profound. In London's Guildhall, a public showing of Holbein's painting on the 1st of June drew throngs of citizens who filed past the canvas in reverent silence. Contemporary accounts record that common folk barrows-wheeling vegetables in the market paused to lift their hats and bow their heads as they passed beneath the portrait. Playwrights and pamphleteers, seizing on the images, hailed Henry as the immortal lion, a figure whose likeness transcended his mortal limits, and whose legacy would command the realm beyond the grave. More subtle was the propagandistic shift in messaging. Whereas earlier chronicles had emphasized Henry's ruthlessness, the executions of 2 queens, the fall of Thomas More, The dissolution of monasteries' new pamphlets framed him as the architect of the Church of England. Leaflets printed in Oxford on the 3rd of July described his severing of papal ties not as schismatic rebellion, but as a unifying act that established a church for every English tongue. Sermons delivered in parish churches echoed this theme, portraying Henry as a visionary who, in cleaving to the crown over the mitre, had forged a national church that would bind his subjects with both spiritual and temporal unity. This careful rebranding served dual purposes. Domestically, it soothed anxieties sparked by the king's death, offering a figure of continuity while empowering the nascent Protestant settlement. Internationally, it reassured Protestant allies and conservative Catholic observers alike that England's policies, though irreversibly changed, were grounded in order and legitimacy rather than mere personal caprice. The images of youth and vigour thus masked the reality of disease and mortality, aligning the myth of Henry VIII with the political imperatives of the Tudor state. In the sleepy quiet of twilight, when candlelight flickered against the painted faces and waxen features of the late king, the Victorian biographer Lord Clarendon would later write that Tudor propaganda reached its zenith in the afterglow of Henry's passing, when art became the handmaiden of power. Indeed, by sanitizing the grotesque final chapters of his life and elevating Henry as the immortal founder of a national church, the court laid the foundation for a royal image that would endure for centuries, an image of unity, strength, and divine sanction that outlived even the mortal frailties of the monarch himself. Following the tumult of Henry VIII's final days, it was not until the 19th century that his case truly captured the attention of medical scholarship. In the year 1813, specifically on April 10th, workers at Windsor Castle opened the lead-sealed coffin during chapel repairs, exposing the king's remains for the first time in more than 260 years. Reports from that opening noted that his skeleton measured roughly 6 feet 2 inches in height, with a waist circumference inferred from the dimensions of his armour at nearly 50 inches. Victorian physicians, steeped in moral interpretations of disease, seized upon these details. By the year 1870, the London Medical Review published a series of speculative articles attributing Henry's suffering to syphilis, then commonly referred to as maladie d'Amérique, and asserting that his physical decline was a divine chastisement for his numerous marital transgressions. In 1872, Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith wrote in the British Journal of Clinical Observation that the ulcerations upon the late king's legs bear the unmistakable hallmarks of tertiary syphilis, a view that resonated with the era's emphasis on moral causality in medical ailments. As the 20th century dawned, this moralistic framing gave way to more clinical interpretations grounded in emerging understandings of metabolic disorders. In 1952, Sir Geoffrey Keynes revisited the Tudor surgeon's detailed casebooks, volumes meticulously kept between September 1546 and January 1547, and published a seminal paper arguing that type 2 diabetes mellitus beta explained the king's prodigious weight gain and refractory infections. Keynes demonstrated that Henry underwent bloodletting on no fewer than 63 occasions during his final year, each session recorded with the exact amount of blood removed, sometimes over 2 pints at a time. Further, Keynes identified gout as a significant contributor to Henry's episodic joint flare-ups, noting that contemporaneous observers described burning pain so severe that the king would strike the floor with his clenched fist during attacks. Osteomyelitis, an invasive bone infection, was also posited as the root cause of the leg ulcers that defied every poultice and cauterization applied by court physicians. By 1974, additional analysis appeared in the Journal of Medieval Medicine. Dr. Elaine Phillips reviewed skeletal fragments and documented evidence of chronic bone degeneration consistent with infection, alongside healed fractures in Henry's ribs and skull, likely resulting from jousting accidents in his younger years. Phillips suggested that repeated cranial trauma might have contributed to cognitive disturbances noted in the king's later letters, drawing a parallel to modern chronic traumatic encephalopathy, observed in athletes exposed to repeated head injuries. In the early years of the 21st century, hypotheses grew yet more nuanced. A 2005 study in the British Journal of Royal Medicine explored the possibility of an inherited genetic disorder, such as McLeod syndrome, characterized by red blood cell anomalies, muscle weakness, and psychiatric symptoms. Geneticists noted that descriptions of Henry's mental volatility and physical frailty aligned with the rare constellation of neurological and hematological signs seen in documented cases of this syndrome. Meanwhile, neurologists reopened the debate on chronic traumatic injury, pointing to Henry's well-documented history of serious tilting injuries at tournaments, one in 1520, involving a fall that fractured his shoulder, as potential sources of cumulative brain damage. Crucial to all these discussions have been the fragments of the king's remains examined during the 19th century exhumations. In 1893, the anatomist Sir James Paget was granted permission to inspect the skeletal remains during further chapel renovations. Paget's detailed report recorded extensive joint erosion in both hips and knees, as well as signs of vertebral degeneration that likely contributed to the severe back pain Henry endured. He also noted that the leg bones showed evidence of osteomyelitic lesions, dark, pitted areas indicating bone necrosis, and that muscle attachment sites were hypertrophied in some regions, reflecting the king's once formidable strength, even as his body succumbed to decay. These layered interpretations, moral punishment in the 19th century, metabolic and rheumatic conditions in the 20th, and genetic or traumatic causes in the 21st, highlight both the enduring fascination with Henry VIII's last illness and the evolving nature of medical knowledge itself. The Tudor court's own records, unusually comprehensive for the medieval period, provided the raw data. Every poultice prescription, every bloodletting date, and each physician's observation meticulously catalogued. From the dim corridors of Whitehall to the sterile reading rooms of modern universities, the king's suffering has served as a case study in the limits of pre-modern medicine, the progression of diagnostic frameworks, and the complex interplay between biology, environment, and history. In the half-sleeping reverie of candlelit archives, Henry's final chapters continue to inform our understanding of disease, mortality, and the fragile boundary that separates sovereign might from human vulnerability. And so, as the echoes of royal footsteps and the solemn hush of council chambers give way to the gentle stillness of a winter's night, we leave behind the grand tapestries and forged seals of power. Imagine now the soft glow of candlelight fading, its last tendrils of warmth curling into the shadows of Whitehall's silent corridors. The pain and turmoil of King Henry's final days recede into the distance, like distant thunder rolling away beyond a calm horizon. Feel the weight of centuries lift gently from your shoulders as you settle into the comforting embrace of memory. Picture the once formidable monarch, garbed in stately robes, now at rest, his life's tumult smoothed by time's gentle hand. Let the image of his trials dissolve like mist at dawn, leaving only the quiet lessons they impart, that even the strongest among us must yield to the cycles of change, and that true greatness lies not in dominion over others, but in the grace with which we face our own mortality. As your breath deepens, allow the rhythm of the story to slow, each word unfurling languidly like petals upon a still pond. Notice how the troubled echoes of power and unrest give way to a soft, enduring truth. That empathy and understanding endure, long after crowns and thrones have crumbled. In the flicker of a dying candle, see reflected the warmth of compassion, the very spark that binds us, year after year, across the tapestry of human experience. Now, let the final scene blur at the edges, its once vivid colours gently washed by the hush of twilight. Hear the faint whisper of wind through empty courtyards, carrying with it the promise of renewal. Feel how the cold stone beneath your feet softens into mossy earth, inviting you to rest. In this quiet moment, the burdens of history fall away, replaced by the tender reassurance that every ending is but the prelude to a new beginning. And so, dear listener, let your eyelids grow heavy as you drift toward peaceful slumber. Carry with you the message that even the greatest of kings found solace in stillness, and that in our own lives, we too can discover strength in surrender and hope in gentle reflection. May this story's final sigh be the soft lullaby that guides you into dreams. Sleep well, and if you have enjoyed this journey through time, please subscribe to our channel for more tranquil tales and timeless reflections. Good night, and sweet dreams.